I should never have brought Owen to Jerome that late in the season. But when your son spends 3 straight weeks asking to see an old mountain town he found in a school library book, the request starts to sound harmless. He wanted to see the abandoned mining streets, the little tourist train that no longer ran, the steep roads cut into the hillside, and most of all the old roadside amusement park someone online had photographed years ago and then forgotten. I told myself it would be good for both of us. 2 days away from Phoenix. 2 days away from school, work, traffic, and the kind of apartment silence that gets worse when a father stops calling as often as he promises he will. The drive north was long, climbing into colder air with every mile. Owen spent most of it pressed to the window, talking less than usual. That was the first thing that should have bothered me. He was 8, bright, stubborn, and almost never quiet for more than a few minutes unless he was sick or asleep. But after we passed the old mine road that cut into the rock below Jerome, he stopped asking questions. He just kept staring toward the mountain like he had seen something in the stone. "You okay back there?" I asked. He looked at me through the rearview mirror and nodded. "You sure?" "Yeah." But he kept watching the dark opening in the hillside until the road curved and it vanished. Jerome looked exactly the way the pictures had promised and nothing like the way a real place should feel. The town clung to the mountain in a way that made every building seem temporary, as if one hard wind might peel it loose and send it sliding into the valley. Old brick storefronts leaned toward narrow streets. Wooden stairways climbed steep grades between retaining walls and rusted railings. The few tourists still around moved slowly, bundled in jackets against the high desert cold. Most of the summer crowds were gone. The shops were open, but the town felt emptied out in a deeper way. We checked into a small motor lodge near the edge of town, one of those old places with exterior doors and a flickering vacancy sign. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Marlene. She was somewhere in her 60s, narrow-faced, gray-haired, and slow in the deliberate way of people who miss very little. When I mentioned that Owen wanted to visit the abandoned park outside town, her hand stopped over the key rack. "That place has been shut for years," she said. "I know. I heard people still walk around the outside." "Some do." She looked past me toward the window. "Not many this time of year." Owen stepped up beside me. "Is there really a tunnel behind it?" Marlene's eyes moved down to him. For just a second, something passed over her face, something I couldn't name at the time. "There's an old service cut in the hill," she said. "Left over from the mine days. Can we go see it?" Owen asked me. I laughed softly. "We'll see the park first." Marlene took the room key off the hook and handed it over. "If you go," she said, "don't stay late. And don't go near the tunnel." I gave her the polite smile people use when they think they're hearing harmless local superstition. That night, the wind pressed against our motel window with a thin, steady hiss. Owen fell asleep quickly, curled around the stuffed bear he still slept with when nobody else was around to notice. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched him breathe, telling myself I was being overprotective, telling myself it was only the unfamiliar building, the colder air, the way mountain towns can feel abandoned even when they aren't. Before turning off the lamp, I remembered something he had asked me the week before. "Mom," he had said while doing homework at the kitchen table, "if a werewolf was real, would people know right away?" I had laughed, because that was what adults are supposed to do. How would they know? He had looked up at me with perfect seriousness. "By the smell." I had asked what smell, but he only shrugged and went back to his worksheet. I slept badly. The room creaked. Pipes knocked in the wall. Once, sometime after midnight, I sat up because I thought I heard footsteps outside our door. When I looked through the curtain, the parking lot was empty except for my car, a soda machine glowing blue by the office, and the black shape of the hillside beyond the motel. Morning came clear and hard and bright. The cold had sharpened overnight. Owen was excited again, at least at first. We ate toasted bagels from the motel breakfast room, then walked toward the park with our jackets zipped up to our throats. Near the trailhead just outside town, a man was renting horses for late-season tourists. Owen begged to ride one down the old road, but the man shook his head before I had even fully asked. "Not today," he said. "They're jumpy." One of the saddled horses pinned its ears and stared toward the lower road that led out of town. Probably coyotes, I offered. The man looked at me, then at the horse. Not coyotes, he said. We kept walking. The abandoned park sat behind a half-collapsed fence beyond a bend in the dirt road. It was smaller than the pictures had made it seem. A rusting Ferris wheel no taller than the nearby cottonwoods. A cracked carousel under a warped canopy. A small slide. A row of game booths with no prizes. Only sun-bleached plywood and broken counter glass. Everything was coated with dust, old paint, and the kind of neglect that makes a place feel stripped of memory. No kids, no attendants, no birds, only wind. Owen ran a few steps ahead, then stopped so suddenly that I almost bumped into him. At the far end of the property, partially hidden behind a collapsed service shed and a sagging section of fence, there was a dark opening in the hill. Not decorative, not part of the park. Concrete framed, old, permanent. A tunnel. Owen stared at it without blinking. "Mom," he said quietly, "there's someone in there." I followed his gaze and saw only blackness. "It's just a tunnel," I said. He didn't move. "No," he whispered. "Something in there is smelling the metal." A gust of cold air came off the hillside and every hair on my arms rose at once. That was the moment the trip stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling like something worse. I tried to turn it into nothing. That is what mothers do when fear appears too early. We give it smaller names. We call it imagination, shadows, nerves, bad weather, old stories, anything that can be folded into reason and carried away. I told Owen the tunnel probably smelled like rust and wet stone. I pointed at the rides and suggested we explore the carousel, the ticket booth, the old bumper car awning with its torn fabric slapping faintly in the wind. He nodded, but he kept glancing toward the hill. The smell reached me a few minutes later. At first I thought it was only rust heating under the sun, but the air had stayed cold and the scent sharpened instead of fading. There was something wet under the metal smell, something raw. I had once cut my hand badly opening a soup can and remembered how the blood had made the whole kitchen smell like pennies and warm iron. This was close to that, only colder, less human, more open, as if the whole hillside were breathing through a wound. "Mom," Owen said, stepping closer, "do you smell it now?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to say he had planted the idea in my head, but I did smell it. We walked carefully between the rides. The gravel under our shoes crackled too loudly in the silence. There should have been birds in the cottonwoods, or at least the dry chirp of something hidden in the brush. Instead, the whole park held its breath in a way I could feel in my throat. The old carousel stood slightly tilted, its painted horses chipped down to wood and gray primer. Owen reached out to touch one and then pulled his hand back before he made contact. "What?" I asked. He shook his head. "I thought I heard something." "From where?" He looked toward the tunnel. I did too. The entrance sat maybe 60 yards away, ringed with cracked concrete and old service pipes half buried in dirt. Its darkness looked thicker now, not like empty shade, but like depth, like there was a long space inside it collecting cold. The metal railing along the sloped path to the entrance was corroded to a reddish black. On the ground below it, the dust had been disturbed. I crouched for a better look. Marks. Not clear footprints, not yet, just dragged patterns in the dirt and small clumps where something heavy had pressed and shifted. They could have been animal tracks worn down by wind. They could have been old. Behind us, down the road, a horse screamed. Not whinnied, screamed. I turned in time to see a brown rental horse standing rigid at the edge of the road, reins dragging. It had either broken loose or been dropped. Its nostrils were wide, its head lifted high, eyes rolled so far white showed around them. The animal was staring directly toward the tunnel. It would not come closer. It planted itself and trembled, every muscle in its body locked. Owen gripped my jacket sleeve. "It knows." I took a cautious step toward the horse, thinking I could catch it before it bolted into the brush. The second I moved, it jerked backward, hooves skidding, and then tore up the road in a panic, dirt and loose stones spraying behind it. The noise faded fast. Silence returned all at once. I became aware of Owen's hand in mine, painfully tight. "Let's go," I said. We had taken maybe 3 steps toward the gate when 2 yellow reflections appeared inside the tunnel, low to the ground. too far apart to belong to any dog I had ever seen. They did not move at first. They simply hung there in the dark, faint but unmistakable, the way an animal's eyes sometimes catch light at night. Only there was no flashlight on them, no car headlights, nothing to create that glow. They looked as though they were producing it. Owen made a thin, frightened sound behind his teeth. The eyes blinked once, then vanished. Every part of my body went cold at once. Not the outside cold of weather, a deeper one that moved inward, fast and deliberate, like something had exhaled through my ribs. I pulled Owen toward me and backed away. Then the sound came. It was not a growl, not exactly. More like a long breath pushed slowly through a chest too large for the tunnel that held it. Wet, heavy, controlled. The kind of breathing you hear from something tired and dangerous that has decided not to rush because it doesn't need to. Owen began to cry. I didn't tell him to be quiet. I didn't tell him to calm down. I grabbed his hand and moved as fast as I could without falling, dragging him between the dead rides, through the broken gate, back onto the road. We ran until the park had disappeared behind the bend. Only then did I stop, bent over, trying to breathe. Owen was sobbing now, real sobs that shook his whole body. "It saw us," he said. "No," I lied. "It was probably just a mountain lion." He looked up at me with a face so frightened it made me feel ashamed. "Mountain lions don't smell metal," he whispered. We hurried back to town. By the time we reached the motel office, Marlene was outside, sweeping leaves away from the walkway. She took one look at us and set the broom against the wall. "You went to the park." It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth to tell her nothing had happened, that we had only gotten spooked by some animal in the tunnel. But Owen spoke first. "There was something in there," he said. "It had yellow eyes." Marlene stayed quiet for several seconds. The wind moved the fringe of her scarf. Somewhere down the road, a screen door banged once and then was still. Finally, she said, "People around here call it a werewolf because they don't know what else to call it." My skin prickled. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the word was so wrong for daylight and motel parking lots and my son's wet face in the ordinary backpack hanging off one shoulder. Werewolf belonged to movies, campfire stories, things with full moons and silver bullets and rules simple enough to repeat. It did not belong to old parks on the edge of Arizona mining towns. "That's ridiculous," I said, but I heard the weakness in my own voice. Marlene looked at me, not offended, not defensive, just tired. "Maybe," she said, "but it doesn't change what saw you." She bent, picked up the broom and added quietly, "And if it looked back, it won't forget." I took Owen inside without answering. Up in our room, he pulled out his sketchbook and drew the tunnel from memory. When he finished, he turned it toward me. 2 yellow circles floated in black pencil darkness. Under them, in careful block letters, he had written, "The eyes show when they want to." I told myself children write strange things when they're scared. I told myself that over and over, while the afternoon light faded, and the cold crept back into the town. But even then, somewhere under all that effort, I already knew something had chosen to notice us. And I had the awful feeling that leaving the park had not meant leaving it behind. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of false normalcy. I kept the motel television on low, even though neither of us watched it. I made Owen drink water, then hot chocolate from a vending machine packet Marlene gave him. I sat at the little table by the window pretending to answer work emails, while my eyes kept drifting to the parking lot, the alley beside the office, the darkening hillside beyond town. If I caught myself listening too hard to the wind, I forced my attention somewhere else. Owen stayed on the bed with his sketchbook. He did not draw anything new for nearly an hour. Then, without warning, he flipped to a clean page and started again. His face had that distant concentration children sometimes get when they are trying to record something exactly as it happened. I did not interrupt him. By the time he was done, the second drawing was worse than the first. The tunnel again, the same 2 yellow eyes. But this time he had drawn a line of little scratches in the dirt leading toward the opening, and beside them a shape like a handprint that wasn't really a hand. "What's that?" I asked. He shrugged. "I think it was there before we got there." "Why do you think that?" "Because it looked like it waits." I wanted to ask what that meant, but the seriousness in his expression stopped me. There are moments when children sound less like children, and more like people relaying information they don't fully understand. That was one of them. At dusk, we went downstairs to the small breakfast room because I couldn't bear the idea of sitting in the room after dark. Marlene heated canned chili and set out slices of bread. There were only 2 other guests, a couple from Flagstaff, both in hiking gear, both looking as though the town had not turned out to be the peaceful little getaway they had expected. The man was saying, "Something was outside our wall last night, not walking, scraping, like it had claws." His wife told him to stop. Marlene said nothing at all. She only kept pouring coffee. Owen ate 3 spoonfuls of chili and then pushed the bowl away. He kept glancing at the window beside our table. Outside, the town had emptied quickly. Jerome, after sunset in the off-season, felt less like a tourist spot and more like a place closing itself. Lights glowed in a few storefronts. A pickup drove by. Then even that small motion died down. When we went back to the room, Owen said he didn't want to sleep in the second bed. I didn't argue. He curled beside me under the blanket and asked very quietly, "Do werewolves come inside houses?" "They're not real," I said automatically. He turned his head and looked at me in the dim light from the parking lot outside. Then what was in the tunnel? I had no answer that didn't sound stupid even to me. He fell asleep before I did. I lay awake, listening. The motel had settled into nighttime sounds. Pipes, old framing, distant wind, the occasional car in town. I kept thinking I heard something under those sounds, a slow rhythm that would vanish whenever I tried to isolate it. Round midnight, I almost convinced myself I was imagining everything. Then Owen sat up so fast the mattress bounced. "Mom!" I was instantly awake. "What?" He was staring at the window, his body rigid. "It's outside." A pulse of cold moved through me. "What is?" "The thing from the tunnel." I slid out of bed without turning on the lamp. The room was dark except for the weak yellow glow leaking around the edges of the curtain. I reached the window and held still long enough to listen. Nothing. My hand shook when I pinched the curtain fabric and moved it aside an inch. The parking lot was empty. The soda machine by the office hummed blue. My car sat where I'd left it. Past the last row of doors, a narrow gravel alley ran along the side of the building toward a retaining wall and the shadowed rise of the hill. I almost let the curtain fall. Then I saw it. At the far end of the alley, where the security light failed to reach, a shape stood against the wall. Too tall to be a dog, too bent to be a person. It was not moving, but the longer I looked, the more wrong its stillness became. It held itself in a forward lean, as if its spine bent differently from ours, as if standing upright was an option rather than a natural position. I squinted, trying to understand the outline. The head turned, not quickly, deliberately, toward our room. I let the curtain drop and stepped back so hard my calf hit the bed frame. Owen was crying softly now, one hand over his mouth to keep from making noise. "It found us," he whispered. Before I could say anything, something moved outside on the gravel. Step, drag, step, drag. The pace was slow and unhurried, the way something large might move when it knew it had nowhere else it needed to be. The sound came closer until it stopped directly below the window. Then came the breathing. Deep, wet, patient. It was so close I could almost feel it through the glass. Owen buried his face against my stomach. I put one hand over the back of his head and stared at the curtain as if I could keep whatever was outside from entering simply by refusing to blink. My mouth had gone dry. Every second stretched painfully long. The breathing continued. Once something tapped lightly against the outer wall, no louder than a finger on wood. Then nothing. Not silence exactly. I could still hear the hum of the soda machine, the distant rattle of wind through a sign somewhere down the road. But the breathing had stopped so completely that the room seemed larger without it. After what felt like forever, the steps started again. Step, drag, step, drag. They moved away from the window, toward the back of the motel, toward open dark. I did not sleep again that night. At dawn, I forced myself outside. The cold hit hard enough to make my eyes water. I walked to the dirt strip beneath the window and saw the tracks immediately. They were too deep to belong to anything light. Not boots, not paws, not hooves. Each impression had an elongated front, as if narrow toes or claws had pressed into the ground before the rest of the weight settled. There were drag marks too, shallow arcs in the dirt, like something had shifted its stance without fully lifting. Marlene stood in the office doorway holding a coffee mug. "It came here," I said. She nodded once as though I had just confirmed the weather. "You need to leave," I told her. A faint, humorless expression moved across her face. "If leaving fixed it," she said, "this town would be empty." I stared at the tracks again. "We're going home," I said. "You should." She took a sip of coffee. "Just don't confuse going home with being safe." I looked up at her, anger rising through fear because anger was easier to carry. "If you knew this thing was real, why didn't you warn us better?" "I did." "No, you told me not to go near the tunnel like it was some local ghost story." Her eyes hardened just a little. "People don't hear the truth when it sounds impossible," she said. "They only hear it after." I had no answer for that. Back in the room, while I packed in frantic, uneven movements, Owen sat on the bed holding his bear and watching me. "Are we leaving because it saw us?" he asked. "Yes." "Will it come with us?" I stopped folding a sweatshirt and looked at him. "No," I said. But even as I said it, I knew I did not believe myself. And that frightened me more than the shape in the alley ever could. I packed too fast and forgot half the things I meant to grab. That's one of the details that has stayed with me. Not the dramatic parts, not the monster in the dark feeling, but the stupid human ones. A phone charger left by the lamp. Owen's toothbrush still in the bathroom cup. One of my gloves missing. Fear turns you practical and useless at the same time. Owen didn't complain. He didn't ask for breakfast. He just sat on the bed hugging his stuffed bear, watching every movement I made as if the speed of my packing could decide whether we got out in time. When I went to check out, Marlene was behind the desk, counting small bills from an envelope. She looked at my face, then at Owen, and slid the card reader aside before I could pull out my wallet. "You don't owe me for the second night," she said. "I'm paying." She shook her head. I pushed the card forward anyway. "Please." For a moment I thought she might insist, but instead she took my hand in both of hers. Her fingers were cold and dry and stronger than I expected. "Drive straight down the mountain," she said. "Do not stop at the overlook, do not stop at the park, and do not stop if you think you see it." Something in the way she said that last part made my throat tighten. "I'm not stopping for anything," I told her. She let go of my hand. "Good." Outside, the morning light was painfully clear. Jerome looked almost harmless in daylight, the old buildings bright against the red-brown slopes, the valley open under a huge Arizona sky. My fear felt irrational for about 3 seconds. Then Owen stopped beside the car and stared toward the lower road. "What?" I asked. He pointed. It was watching from there. All I saw was a retaining wall, some dead brush, and the empty shoulder of the road. I put him in the back seat, buckled him in myself, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. The road out of Jerome coiled down the mountain in tight turns. The farther we descended, the more exposed everything felt. Bare hillsides, pull-offs overlooking dry washes and rock cuts, long patches without another vehicle in sight. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the mirrors too often. Owen was quiet for the first few miles. Then, just before the road straightened near the old park access turnoff, he said, "Mom, don't slow down." I hadn't realized I was. The park lay off to the right, visible through a break in the brush. The rusted Ferris wheel rose above the fence line like the bones of something mechanical left out in the weather. I should have kept my eyes on the road. Instead, I glanced toward it. Something dark lay near the entrance fence. At first, I thought it was a pile of old tarp or a fallen sign. Then the shape resolved into a horse. Brown hide, folded legs, neck bent wrong. My stomach lurched. "Mom," Owen said sharply. "Go." I pressed harder on the gas. We passed the park and entered the narrow mine cut through the rock a few minutes later, the one we had driven past on the way in. It wasn't the tunnel behind the park, but it was close enough to the same part of the hillside that I felt my chest tighten the second we entered. The road shrank to one lane. The walls rose wet and dark on either side. Water dripped from the stone. My headlights hit old mineral streaks that flashed white, then vanished. About halfway through, Owen screamed, "Behind us!" I jerked my eyes to the rearview mirror. At the far mouth of the tunnel, something had entered the lane. For one impossible second, I thought it was a person running bent over. Then it covered too much ground too quickly, and the proportions stopped making sense. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, the head held low and forward in a way no human body could sustain. It moved with a broken rhythm that should have slowed it but somehow made it faster. Its eyes reflected yellow in the red wash of my brake lights. I hit the accelerator so hard the car fishtailed on the damp surface. The rear end skidded, corrected, then lunged forward. Owen was crying and yelling something I couldn't understand. My own breath had gone ragged, almost sobbing. The thing gained on us. I saw one hand, if that's what it was, hit the tunnel wall and push off, claws or fingers scraping sparks from stone. Then it reached the car. A slam struck the back end so violently that the whole frame shuddered. Owen screamed louder. I tasted metal in my own mouth, realized I had bitten the inside of my cheek and kept driving. The daylight at the far end looked impossibly small. For one horrible stretch of seconds, it seemed not to grow at all. Then suddenly, it was there. We burst out into sun so bright it erased everything else. I kept going, tires spitting gravel as the road widened again. I did not stop at the turnout. I did not stop at the gas station 20 miles later. I did not stop until I had been driving nearly an hour, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. When I finally pulled onto a shoulder near a dry creek bed, Owen was curled against the door, crying quietly. "It hit us," he said. I turned around in my seat and saw that he was unharmed. Pale, terrified, but unharmed. "Stay inside," I said. I got out and walked around to the back of the car. 4 fresh gouges cut across the rear glass and down the trunk, long and deep enough that the paint had curled at the edges. They were too even to be random damage. Too recent. I could still see powdered glass glittering in the seam near the trunk latch. I stood there in the sun with the desert wind moving over the road and felt a part of my mind split cleanly in two. One half said there had to be an explanation. Some animal, some accident, something that could fit inside the world I already knew. The other half had seen those eyes gaining on us in the tunnel and no longer believed in that kind of rescue. I got back in the car and drove straight to Phoenix. By the time we reached the apartment, the sun had dropped and the city looked ordinary in the cruelest possible way. Traffic lights, strip malls, delivery trucks, kids on bikes in the next complex over. Everything familiar and intact. Everything proving how absurd the whole experience would sound if I ever tried to tell it out loud. Inside, Owen went straight to his room without taking off his shoes. I locked every door and checked every window. Later, when I went in to tell him dinner was ready, I found a new drawing on his desk. The tunnel, the road, the shape behind our car, all long limbs and lowered head. At the bottom of the page, in a child's tight, careful handwriting, he had written, "It knows where we live now." I stood there staring at those words long enough that Owen looked up at me and said, "I didn't want to write it. I just knew it." That was the first night I locked my bedroom door. It was not the last. For the next several days, I tried to rebuild our life by force. Routine is a kind of spell when you're afraid. You repeat small-known actions in the hope that fear will shrink to fit them. I got Owen to school every morning. I answered emails. I microwaved dinners. I folded laundry. I signed the permission slip for a class field trip and returned a package to the grocery store customer service desk and paid my electric bill online, as if these ordinary acts were stronger than what had followed us out of the mountain. They weren't. The first sign came from Owen's teacher on Tuesday afternoon. She called while I was at work and asked whether anything had happened on our trip because Owen had been unusually withdrawn. He wasn't playing at recess. He kept looking toward the fence at the far edge of the playground. When another child asked what he was staring at, he told her, "Nothing yet." I told the teacher he was probably tired from traveling. That night, he barely ate. The second sign came from the apartment itself. On Wednesday morning, one of the living room windows was unlatched. I knew I had latched it the night before. I checked them all twice now. But there it was, loose by less than an inch. Not open enough to admit anything large. Not enough for a dramatic moment. Just enough to suggest that something had tested it. I told myself I must have missed it. Then Thursday came. I was boiling pasta when Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway, pale in the way children go pale before they cry. "Mom," he said, "it's outside." My hand tightened on the wooden spoon. "What is?" "The thing from Jerome." I set the spoon down too quickly and sauce splashed onto the stove. "Where?" He pointed toward the front window. "Across the street, next to the blue van." Our apartment was on the 3rd floor overlooking a narrow lot and the street beyond it. I moved carefully to the blinds and separated them with 2 fingers. Cars rolled through the intersection a block away. A man in a reflective vest unloaded boxes from a delivery van. Someone walked a dog on the opposite sidewalk. And beside an old blue plumbing van parked under a jacaranda tree, a shape crouched in the shadow between the vehicle and the curb. At first, it was easy not to see. That was part of what made it so terrible. It occupied the shadow with the confidence of something that understood how people edit what scares them. The longer I looked, the more its shape separated from the van. A bent back, one arm too long. A head lifted just enough that I caught the dull yellow of 2 eyes under the side mirror. I let the blinds snap shut and stepped away. Owen had already backed into the hallway. We went into my bedroom and I locked the door. Then, because locking the door felt inadequate, I shoved the dresser halfway across the floor and braced it against the frame. Owen sat on the bed, clutching his bear while I stood there listening to my own breathing and hating how useless I felt. The normal city sounds faded slowly as the night deepened. Traffic thinned, doors shut, televisions dimmed behind neighboring walls. Then the dogs stopped barking, not one at a time, all at once. The silence that followed was heavier than ordinary quiet. It had the same wrongness as the park, the same held breath. A few minutes later, something scraped lightly against the living room window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape. The scrape came again, then a soft tap on the glass. Owen made a choking noise and buried his face in the blanket. I didn't move. I couldn't. Fear had turned my body into a listening device. I heard every sound from the apartment with painful clarity. The refrigerator motor, the air vent ticking, the faint shift of the dresser settling against the bedroom door. Then footsteps crossed the roof. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Back and forth above our unit, as if something were pacing and thinking. I stayed awake all night. Owen dozed in short bursts and woke crying each time the roof creaked. Just before dawn, the silence loosened. A car engine started somewhere below. A dog barked once, then another answered. The world returned in pieces. When daylight was full, I moved the dresser and walked carefully through the apartment. The living room window was intact, but the concrete sill outside it had 4 shallow gouges running across the painted surface, fresh enough that gray dust still clung to the edges. Above, on the roofline, a strip of metal flashing hung loose and bent. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold and called my sister Emily in Flagstaff. I told her almost everything. Not every detail, because some of them sounded impossible even to me, but enough. The abandoned park, the tunnel, the motel, the thing in the street below our apartment, the roof. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You need help from somebody who knows that area. What kind of person knows something like this?" "I don't know. Somebody old enough to have heard the stories before the internet ruined them." That afternoon, after Owen came home from school and went straight to his room, I searched every combination of words I could think of. Jerome tunnel attacks, abandoned amusement park Arizona, old mine creature, Yellow Eyes Park, livestock deaths near Jerome. Most of it was junk. Hiking forums, ghost story threads, urban legend videos. But buried in a discussion from years earlier, one user mentioned an older man in Cottonwood who knew what comes down from the mine cuts when the tourist season dies. The name was Walter Voss. There was no phone number, only an address. That night I found Owen drawing again. Not just the eyes now, the tunnel, the road, the blue van outside our building, little arrows connecting them. He didn't look up when he said, "It keeps finding the shortest way." A terrible certainty settled into me then. This thing wasn't wandering. It was following. And whatever safety distance should have created, it didn't matter to it at all. By midnight, I had decided we were going north again. Only this time it wouldn't be to sightsee. It would be to find out whether the thing in the tunnel had a name, a pattern, and maybe, if we were lucky, some way to stop it before it stopped pretending to wait outside. Walter Voss lived outside Cottonwood in a low cinder block house at the end of a gravel road bordered by scrub oak and rusted fencing. If someone had told me beforehand that the man who supposedly knew about the thing from Jerome would live there, I would have rolled my eyes at the predictability of it. The place looked exactly like what fear wants from expertise. Isolated, weather-worn, practical, half hidden from the road. 3 dogs started barking before I had fully parked. Walter opened the front door before I reached the porch. He was older than I expected, maybe early 70s, broad-shouldered in the way some men remain broad even after age leans on them. His face was heavily lined, sun-darkened, and set in a permanent expression that was not unkind, but gave very little away. "You came from Jerome," he said. Not a question. I nodded. "How did you know?" He looked down at Owen, then back at me. "Because people don't drive out here for anything else." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something bitter like dried sage burned too long. The walls were crowded with old tools, antlers, lengths of rusted chain, bundles of herbs hanging upside down from nails, and one iron crucifix blackened as if it had once been in a fire. None of it looked theatrical. That bothered me more than if it had. Walter told us to sit at the kitchen table. He poured water into mismatched glasses and waited. I had planned to be careful with my story. I had planned to leave out the word werewolf in the motel and the roof pacing and say only that some animal had followed us from Jerome. But the second I started talking, the whole thing came out. The park, the tunnel, the eyes, the smell of iron, the shape in the alley, the thing running behind our car in the minecut, the blue van, the roof. Walter did not interrupt once. When I finished, Owen spoke quietly from beside me. It looked at me first. Walter nodded as if Owen had confirmed the only detail that really mattered. "That's how it works." I felt my stomach drop. "What does that mean?" Walter sat back in his chair. "It marks a person, usually the one who notices it before the others do." "Marks? What is that supposed to mean?" He folded his hands on the table. "It means once it chooses, it pays attention, sometimes for days, sometimes longer." I heard my own voice sharpen. "What is it?" He glanced toward the window, as if the answer might still be outside, listening. "People call it a werewolf because they need a word," he said. "That's all. It isn't the movie version. It isn't some man changing under the moon. It's older and dumber than that, but not by much. Predator that learned the mines and service tunnels and dry cuts through the mountain. It stays deep when the town is busy. Comes down when things thin out. Easier then. Easier for what? For taking what it wants." Owen's hand found mine under the table. I swallowed. "Can it be killed?" Walter stood without answering and went to a cabinet by the stove. He returned with a glass jar full of fine gray powder. He set it in front of me. "Bone ash, salt, desert sage. Spread it at your windows and doors. It won't stop it if it decides to come through, but it can make it hesitate." I stared at the jar. "Hesitate? That might be the time you need. That's not enough." My voice cracked in the middle. "You understand that, right? It came to my apartment. My son can't sleep. I can't go to the police and explain this. I need to know how to end it." Walter's eyes moved to Owen again. There was something in his expression then that looked dangerously close to pity. "You go back to where it sleeps." Everything in me resisted that at once. "No. That's where it knows the ground. That's where it thinks like itself. If you want it dead, that's where you do it." "With what?" "Fire. Deep enough, hot enough, with no easy path out." He pulled a folded paper from a drawer and spread it on the table. It was an old survey copy of part of the mine system and the maintenance cuts around the abandoned park. He traced one thick finger along a branch of tunnels and shafts, explaining which openings were sealed, which ones still vented, which passages might connect under the hill. I listened, but part of me kept snagging on one fact. "You've seen it before," I said. Walter didn't answer right away. Then he rolled up his sleeve. A scar ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow, wide and twisted as if something with multiple points had raked through muscle and left it to close badly. "Tried once," he said. "Didn't finish the job." "Did anyone die?" He looked at me for a long second. "Yes." Owen squeezed my hand harder. Walter let his sleeve fall and pushed the jar toward me. "Take this home, use it, and make your choices quickly. Once one of these things starts pressing closer, it usually means it has decided waiting is less useful than taking." On the drive back to Phoenix, Owen slept with his head against the window. The jar sat in the passenger seat wrapped in a towel. I drove in silence, replaying every word Walter had said, hating all of them and believing him anyway. That evening, I spread the ash along every windowsill and threshold in the apartment. The powder smelled faintly bitter, almost medicinal. When I finished, there was only half the jar left. At around 3 in the morning, I looked through the blinds. It was standing across the lot under the streetlight, still, watching. It didn't approach. It didn't challenge the door. It only remained there long enough to make one thing perfectly clear. The ash had not frightened it. At best, it had slowed it. And for the first time since Jerome, I understood that surviving a night was not the same thing as getting ahead of what wanted us. It only meant morning had arrived first. And morning, I was beginning to realize, was not on our side nearly as much as people like to think. The next few days taught me the difference between fear and siege. Fear comes in waves. It spikes, breaks, recedes. Siege settles in and starts organizing your life around itself. By Saturday morning, I was no longer asking whether the thing would return. I was measuring time by when it showed itself and by what signs it left when it didn't. Every evening, just after dark, I refreshed the ash lines along the windows and front door. Every morning, I woke and checked for movement, damage, or anything disturbed. I stopped sleeping in my own bed and kept Owen with me in the living room on a mattress pulled against the interior wall where there were no windows. I barely ate. He ate only when I turned it into a game. Still, the signs continued. A bathroom window I knew I had locked stood lifted half an inch on Sunday morning. On Monday, I found 3 shallow marks in the drywall just outside our apartment door, too high for a dog, too close together for accidental damage. On Tuesday night, the iron smell drifted through the air vent so strongly it woke Owen from sleep. He sat up, face pale, and whispered, "It's in the hallway." I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw only an empty corridor washed in weak apartment light yellow. But when I opened the door at sunrise, there were dark smears on the carpet runner near the neighboring unit. Not blood exactly, more like dirt mixed with something wet and organic. The neighbors on our floor started to complain to building management. Mr. Halpern in 3B said he heard something on the roof. A woman on the second floor claimed a large animal had been on the stair landing and vanished before she could get her phone camera open. Nobody said werewolf. Nobody said monster. People said raccoon, coyote, transient, vandal, prank. All the usual words for danger when danger is still being asked to wear a normal face. On Wednesday afternoon, Walter texted me from a number I had never given him. "The ash won't hold it off forever. If you're going back, do it soon." I stared at the message a long time. Owen was at the kitchen table drawing. He hadn't drawn eyes for 2 days, which I had taken as a good sign. When I finally walked over, I saw he had drawn the tunnel again, but this time with smaller side shafts branching off like roots. At the bottom of the page, he had written the same sentence over and over, filling the margin. "It's waiting for us to come back." I sat down across from him. "How do you know that?" He shrugged, still looking at the paper. "Because it acts like when Moose waits for a squirrel." Moose had been our dog years earlier. Owen barely remembered him, but he remembered how still Moose could become before a chase. My chest tightened. That night I called Emily again. She answered on the second ring and said my name in the tone people use when they already know the call is bad news. I told her the truth this time, all of it. The apartment, the roof, the ash, Walter, the tunnel, The fact that I was starting to believe the only way to end this was to go back. Emily listened. Then she said, "Bring Owen here." "What?" "Bring him to me in Flagstaff. Leave him here while you do whatever insane thing you think you have to do." The idea hit me with immediate force because it was both obvious and awful. Of course I should get him away from me. Of course I should put distance between him and the thing. But another part of me, the part Walter's words had poisoned, kept whispering that distance didn't matter because Owen wasn't being followed by proximity. He had been chosen. Still, Flagstaff was better than my apartment. On Friday morning, I packed a duffel for Owen and told him we were visiting Aunt Emily for a few days. He didn't ask why. That frightened me almost more than resistance would have. The drive north felt longer than it had the week before. Maybe because I was spending it rehearsing bad possibilities. Maybe because every time a dark SUV stayed behind us for more than a mile, I checked the mirror too often. Maybe because Owen was quiet again, and I had started to understand that his silence usually meant he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Emily lived in a small apartment near downtown Flagstaff, above a bakery that smelled like yeast and sugar when the windows were open. She hugged Owen first, then hugged me so tightly I almost broke right there in the hallway. "You look awful," she whispered. "I feel worse." Inside, she made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Owen ate more than he had all week, which should have reassured me. Instead, it made me wonder if the thing really had less reach here, or if it was simply allowing me that comfort before taking it away later. When it was time to leave, Owen stood in the doorway with his stuffed bear tucked under one arm. "You're going back to the tunnel," he said. It wasn't a question. My mouth went dry. "I have to check something." He stared at me with an expression children shouldn't wear. "Don't let it think you're slower than it." I bent and hugged him too hard. He smelled like soup and laundry detergent and childhood, and that made what I was about to do feel obscene. From Flagstaff, I drove straight to Walter's house. He was waiting on the porch with a canvas bag, 2 fuel cans, road flares, a heavy hunting knife, a coil of chain, and an old pump shotgun laid across a chair. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." He nodded once as if I had passed some test he never explained. He showed me the map again at his kitchen table, this time marking likely vent shafts and one narrow miner's passage that could lead to a secondary chamber under the park. He packed the flares, the chain, the knife, and extra ash in the bag, then slid the shotgun toward me. "This won't kill it," he said, "but it can hurt it enough to make a gap. I've never fired one of these. You may not need to." That did not comfort me. Before I left, I asked the question I had been trying not to ask. If I kill the wrong one, what happens? Walter looked at the table for a moment. "If there's more than one down there, the one that marked the boy may not be the first one you see." I felt the blood leave my face. "You didn't say there could be more than one." I said these things use old minds. Old minds don't stay empty. I stood there in his kitchen with the bag at my feet and understood that whatever I was driving toward, I did not fully understand it, and never would. But I was already in motion. And Siege had taught me one last ugly truth. Once something starts living inside your daily life, going back to the source feels less like recklessness and more like the only honest direction left. So I loaded the car, turned south toward Jerome, and drove into the falling light with the desert opening ahead of me like a place waiting to test whether a frightened mother could become dangerous enough to matter. I reached Jerome just as the last clean daylight was draining out of the hills. The town looked nearly deserted. A few porch lights glowed. One pickup stood outside a closed restaurant. The temperature had dropped fast, bringing that dry mountain cold that slips through your clothes and settles in your joints before you notice it. I drove past the motel without stopping. Marlene's office was dark. The road to the old park lay empty. I pulled off near the broken fence, killed the engine, and sat in the silence for a moment with my hands still on the wheel. The canvas bag Walter had packed rested in the passenger seat. 2 red flares, the shotgun, the knife, fuel, chain, matches. Enough tools to make me feel prepared for about 30 seconds at a time. Then the smell reached me through the vents. Iron, faint, but unmistakable. I got out. The park looked worse than I remembered. Maybe because I had seen what moved behind its surface now. The Ferris wheel stood still against the darkening sky. Torn canvas on the game booth snapped lightly in the wind. Dead grass scraped along the gravel in dry little whispers. At the back of the property, the tunnel entrance waited in a block of deepening shadow. I took one fuel can, the bag, and a flare. The shotgun I slung over my shoulder awkwardly, already resenting its weight. Every step through the park felt louder than it should have. My boot soles crushed glass, gravel, old bottle caps. Once I looked back at the road, expecting headlights or another person or something human enough to interrupt what I was doing. Nothing. By the time I reached the tunnel, the air near its mouth had gone noticeably colder. I lit the flare. Red light bloomed across the concrete walls and old railing, turning the tunnel entrance into a wound. The darkness inside seemed to pull back slightly, not from fear but from contrast, enough for me to see maybe 30 feet ahead before everything was swallowed again. There were tracks in the dirt, some old, some fresh, not one set. My throat tightened. Walter had warned me, but seeing overlapping impressions in the dust, some deeper, some narrower, some smudged by drag marks, made the idea of multiple things down there suddenly real in a way words had failed to do. I stepped inside. The tunnel sloped gently downward, lined in sections with cracked concrete, then rougher stone where repairs had failed or never happened. Water dripped somewhere deeper in. My flare hissed and spat red sparks. The smell of metal was stronger now, mixed with old dampness and something fatty and unpleasant hiding underneath. About 50 feet in, I found the first side opening, not large enough for machinery. More like a maintenance cut or old access shaft, partially collapsed along one side. Walter's map had shown several. I crouched and splashed fuel along the base of the opening, then continued deeper, leaving a slick line across the floor. The idea was simple enough in theory. Force whatever was below to choose fire or the one path I controlled. In theory, all violence is geometry. In practice, fear makes every action clumsy. My hands shook opening the can. I spilled fuel on my boot. I told myself to slow down and heard the tremor in my own breathing. 10 yards farther in, I heard movement overhead. I froze. A scrape. Then another. Something shifting its weight on an old support beam above the tunnel. The flare threw wild shadows upward. I lifted it slowly. For one suspended second, I saw nothing. Then the shape dropped. It hit the tunnel floor directly ahead of me with a force that shuddered through the ground. I lurched backward, nearly falling, the flare jerking wide enough to light it from the side. No memory I have from that moment is complete. Fear does not record in clean frames. It leaves flashes. A back arched too high. Fur, but patchy in places as if old scars had killed some of it. Arms long enough that the hands almost reached the floor, even half bent. A head that carried too much animal in the jaw and too much intent in the eyes. The eyes were exactly the same yellow as before. The thing did not rush me. That was the worst part. It rose slowly, weight shifting onto its back legs, as though it knew I had nowhere to go but deeper or past it. I threw the flare at the fuel trail between us and jumped backward. The fire caught hard and fast, running in a bright red-orange sheet across the floor and up the side opening behind it. Heat slapped my face. The creature recoiled with a sound that was not a growl, but a short, furious blast of air. I should have run then. Instead, I lifted the shotgun, fumbled the safety, and fired. The blast deafened me. The recoil nearly tore the weapon out of my hands. The thing jerked sideways as pellets ripped fur and stone, but it did not go down. It only became angrier, and from deeper in the tunnel, something answered it. Another voice, then another. My blood went cold. Shapes moved in the dark beyond the flare line. Smaller than the first one maybe, or simply farther away. Eyes flashed, disappeared, flashed again. I heard claws or nails against stone from more than one direction at once. The mine wasn't occupied. It was inhabited. I grabbed the second flare from the bag with fingers that barely worked, struck it, and shoved it into another puddle of fuel near a second side shaft. Fire burst again, larger this time, forcing movement deeper in the tunnel. Something shrieked from the dark. High, thin, ugly enough to raise nausea in my throat. But the first one, the big one, circled the fire instead of retreating. It understood. That realization arrived too late. The creature lunged along the wall where the flames were thinnest, using the tunnel's curve and old service alcoves as cover. By the time I swung the shotgun toward it, it was no longer where I had aimed. It hit the wall to my left and rebounded, landing between me and the tunnel entrance. Now the way out was cut off. The fire behind me grew hotter. Smoke thickened quickly in the enclosed space, bitter and oily from old dust and fuel. I backed away into the dark, one hand groping for the side passage Walter had marked on the map, the narrow miner's crawlway that should connect to a vent chamber. The creature advanced a step, then another. Slow. Its singed fur smoked faintly in the flare light. One side of its face was wet with blood from the shotgun blast, but the eye there still burned yellow. I found the opening by accident, my shoulder hitting rough stone where the tunnel wall broke inward. Without thinking, I turned sideways and forced myself into it. The passage was barely wide enough. My backpack scraped rock. My jacket snagged. Behind me, the creature slammed into the entrance hard enough to shower dust down my neck. It reached in, claws raking stone inches from my legs, but the opening was too narrow for its shoulders. I kept moving. The smoke followed. The passage tightened, then dipped, then suddenly widened. I stumbled into a low chamber with a shaft above it where moonlight leaked down in a pale column. A way out. I started to climb. Below me, from somewhere behind the chamber wall, I heard movement again. Not in the crawl space, somewhere else. It had another route. And in that instant I understood the terrible advantage of things that learn tunnels better than people do. They don't need to chase you directly. They only need to know where you'll have to emerge. The vent shaft was narrower than it had looked from below, and twice as high. I shoved the bag ahead of me, wedging it onto a ledge near the top, then climbed using cracks in the stone and old rusted anchor bolts left from some long-abandoned maintenance platform. My injured hands, cut sometime in the tunnel, I hadn't even noticed when, kept slipping on grit and dust. Below me, the chamber held its own breathing silence for 3 or 4 terrible seconds. Then something entered it. I looked down. The flare light from the tunnel no longer reached this far, but the moon shaft gave just enough pale illumination to sketch movement in pieces. A shoulder first, then the angle of a head, then 2 yellow eyes lifting into the strip of light as the creature stepped beneath me and looked up. It had used another shaft. Walter had been right. The mine system spread under the hill more broadly than any map could fully show. The thing crouched and jumped. Its claws struck the wall below my boots, scraping sparks and stone splinters into my face. I climbed faster, nearly blind with panic. My fingers found the edge of the opening. I kicked, twisted, and dragged myself onto the surface hard enough to bruise ribs and hip, then rolled away across packed dirt and dead grass. The cold night air felt like a slap. For 1 second I lay there gasping, staring at the stars above the park, hearing nothing but my own pulse. Then the sound of claws on stone came up through the vent behind me, and I lurched to my knees. The bag had fallen open. 1 fuel can remained. 2 oil-soaked rags. Matches, the chain. I grabbed a rag, lit it, and dropped it into the vent. Fire flared below, lighting the shaft orange. I glimpsed the creature inside the chamber, twisted in the moving light, face upturned, fur singed, one arm shielding its eyes. It made a sound so violent and furious it barely seemed to come from a throat at all. Then another sound answered it. Farther under the hill, a chorus of movement, not one, more. I snatched the fuel can, unscrewed the cap, and poured everything I had into the vent and across the surrounding cracked earth where side fissures cut through the slope. The fumes hit hard enough to make my eyes water. I lit the second rag and threw it after the first. The blast that followed was muffled, but I felt it in the ground beneath my knees. Flame punched up through the vent opening. Smoke rolled out thick and black. Something below screamed again, shorter this time, and then the whole hillside seemed to shudder as if one chamber under it had partially collapsed. I staggered back, coughing. If I had let myself believe in endings too soon, that would have been the moment. Fire, smoke, silence after. But there was movement beyond the fence. I turned. At first, all I saw was the shadow of the Ferris wheel against the stars and the broken line of the outer fence running toward the road. Then something detached itself from the dark near the ticket booth and stood upright. The bigger one, the one from the tunnel. The one from the alley, the road, the parking lot below my apartment. Half of its fur along the shoulder and neck was blackened from fire. Blood darkened one side of its face. It had not been in the chamber beneath the vent after all. It had driven me there. Let the others take the burn, or escaped by another route before the fire reached them. Its eyes fixed on me. I understood then that I had not hunted it down into its nest. It had herded me into a part of the hill where I could do damage without doing enough. And now it was outside, in the open, between me and the car. I grabbed the shotgun and ran. The thing moved at once. It did not sprint like an animal in a field. It crossed ground the way it had crossed the tunnel. Wrongly, with that broken rhythm that somehow made it faster. I cut across the dead grass toward the fence opening near the road. It hit the ticket booth hard enough to splinter old plywood in a shower of rotten wood, rebounded, and came after me with terrifying precision. I reached the car just ahead of it, dropped the shotgun trying to get the door open, and nearly left the keys on the seat in my panic. By the time I slammed the lock down and twisted the ignition, it was at the rear quarter panel. The impact rocked the whole vehicle. I jammed the car into reverse, fishtailed out of the gravel turnout, then threw it into drive and tore down the road so fast the rear wheels threw stones against the undercarriage. For the first half mile, I expected to see it in the mirror. I did not. At the junction with the main road, I finally risked glancing sideways at the passenger seat. My blood turned to ice. Owen's stuffed bear lay there. I had not brought it. I had left it in Flagstaff with Emily. A folded piece of paper was tucked under one plush arm. I pulled onto the shoulder only long enough to grab it. My hands shook so badly I almost tore it opening it. Inside, written in jagged block letters that were not Owen's and not mine, were 7 words. I know which one is mine. I don't remember the next several miles clearly. Only flashes. Headlights on empty road. The steering wheel slick in my hands. My own breathing too fast and loud in the car. The bear staring at me from the passenger seat like proof that distance meant absolutely nothing. I drove straight to Flagstaff. Emily opened the apartment door in pajamas, confused and already alarmed by whatever she saw in my face. I pushed past her and went to the spare room. Owen was there, asleep. His own bear was in bed with him. I almost dropped where I stood. Then I looked down at the bear I had brought from Jerome. It was not Owen's. It was older, dirtier, one eye half missing, and around one paw, tied with a strip of something that looked like dried hide, was another note. I hadn't seen it in the car. This one said, "He noticed me first." I stood there in Emily's apartment with both notes in my hand and understood something I had not allowed myself to imagine fully before. Whatever had marked Owen was not acting from hunger alone. It recognized sequence, attention, fear. It remembered. And if it could leave tokens, if it could carry objects, if it could choose what to show and when, then every hopeful simplification I had made about it was gone. This was not a dumb animal using tunnels. It was a predator with habits, territory, and something close enough to malice that the difference no longer mattered. I called Walter from Emily's kitchen while dawn was still hours away. He listened quietly to everything: the vent shaft, the explosion, the surviving creature, the false bear, the notes. When I finished, he said, "You burned part of the nest, not the one that marked the boy. What do I do now?" A long pause. Then, "You bring the boy back." My whole body went rigid. "No. If it marked him, it wants him in sight. That's the bait it will choose over caution. You're asking me to put him in front of that thing. I'm telling you the thing is going to keep coming until the choice is taken away from both of you." I wanted to hang up. I wanted to throw the phone through Emily's kitchen window. Instead, I stood there shaking, while the city outside remained perfectly normal, as if all possible horror were still a local problem somewhere else. Then the dogs in the apartment courtyard stopped barking. All at once, the iron smell slid under the front door, and Owen from the hallway behind me said in a small, clear voice, "It found us again." There are moments in a life when every remaining option becomes immoral in a different way. That was one of mine. We left before sunrise. Emily cried in the parking lot while I loaded the car. She argued until the last possible second, telling me there had to be another way. another place to run, another person to ask. I wanted her to be right badly enough to hate her for saying it, but the iron smell had stayed in the apartment hallway until dawn. Twice during the night I had heard movement on the exterior stairs. Once, something touched the kitchen window and slid away before I could force myself to look. Running had become a delay, not a plan. Owen climbed into the back seat without complaint. He held his real stuffed bear in his lap and watched me through the mirror with a stillness that made him seem older than any 8-year-old should. Walter met us outside Cottonwood, not at his house, but in a gravel lot behind a feed store just off the road. He had brought the shotgun, more fuel, extra flares, a longer coil of chain and a length of old blasting cord he said had once belonged to a mining crew and still burned hot enough to matter. He looked tired and more grim than before, which I had not thought possible. When he opened the rear door and saw Owen, he crouched until they were eye level. "You stay where your mother tells you," he said, "no matter what you hear." Owen nodded. Walter stood and handed me a fresh jar of ash. "One line around the tunnel mouth once we're set. Not because it'll hold him, because if he crosses it, I want to see exactly where." The drive into Jerome passed in near total silence. The town was even emptier than before. A few lights glowed in upper windows. No one stood outside. The motel office remained dark. I had the ugly thought that Marlene either already knew what was coming or had decided not to be near any part of it. We reached the abandoned park in the last hour of daylight. Walter moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this in his mind for years. He laid fuel in 2 paths, one at the tunnel mouth, another along the outer edge of a side vent cut he said connected deeper under the hill. He tied one end of the chain to a support post near the entrance and left the rest coiled, though he never explained exactly how he meant to use it. The blasting cord he threaded through fuel-soaked rags and old dry debris near the lower opening. I spread the ash across the tunnel entrance with shaking hands. The line looked absurdly thin against all that dark. Owen stayed beside the car until Walter called him forward. When he stepped onto the path leading to the tunnel, the whole park seemed to notice. The wind shifted. The iron smell strengthened at once. Walter saw it too. "So did it," he muttered. We entered with me in front holding a flare, Owen behind me gripping my coat, Walter at the rear with the shotgun. The red light painted everything raw. The old tunnel seemed narrower with 3 of us inside. Every drip, every scrape of boot on stone, every breath came back from the walls sounding distorted. We did not have to go far. It stepped out from a side passage maybe 20 feet ahead, bigger than I remembered, burn-scarred along one shoulder, one ear half gone, face blood darkened where the earlier shot had torn through flesh, and its eyes locked not on me, not on Walter, but on Owen. Walter fired first. The blast exploded through the tunnel and the creature jerked sideways, slammed against the wall, then righted itself with a speed so unnatural it made my legs nearly fail. It came forward anyway. "Now!" Walter shouted. I threw the flare onto the fuel line at the entrance. Flame raced outward and upward in a sudden sheet, cutting the main passage behind the creature and turning the tunnel into a corridor of pulsing orange light. Walter fired again. This time the shot took more from its side, tearing fur and flesh, but still it advanced. Owen was crying now, not from panic alone, but from the terrible effort of staying where I had told him. Walter yanked the chain up and swung it low across the tunnel floor just as the creature lunged. One leg caught. Its body twisted, slammed hard into the concrete wall, and for the first time I heard something from it that sounded almost like pain. "Take him!" Walter yelled at me. He did not need to say where. The vent passage. The same narrow shaft that had saved me once. I grabbed Owen and dragged him toward it while Walter moved forward instead of back, firing the shotgun a 3rd time at close range. The creature hit him before the echo died. I heard the impact, heard Walter grunt, heard claws or teeth strike chain and stone. I did not turn. Fear and obedience had become the same thing. The vent passage was harder with Owen than alone. I had to shove him ahead, guide his feet, keep him from looking back when the sounds behind us grew wet and violent. Smoke began to push into the crawl space from the burning fuel line in the main tunnel. Owen coughed. I pushed him harder. We reached the chamber under the vent shaft. Moonlight filtered down from above in a pale beam. "Climb," I told him. He obeyed instantly, scrambling upward using bolts and cracks in the stone. I stayed beneath him, pushing when he slipped, almost lifting him the last few feet until he disappeared through the top. Then the chamber behind me filled with movement. The creature had made it through. It was wounded badly now. Blood ran dark down one foreleg. Parts of its fur still smoked from the fire. One eye was narrowed nearly shut, but it was alive, furious, and still focused past me, toward the opening where Owen had gone. I climbed. It jumped. Pain exploded through my lower leg as claws hooked above my ankle and ripped downward. I screamed and kicked hard with the other foot, striking somewhere soft enough to make it loosen. Above me, Owen had flattened himself to the ground at the top of the shaft and was reaching down, crying my name over and over. I dragged myself up with everything I had left. The second I rolled free onto the surface, I grabbed the last fuel can Walter had left by the vent and dumped it into the shaft. The creature roared below, climbing again. I struck the final flare with shaking hands so violent I almost dropped it. Then I threw it. The blast from the vent was deeper and harsher than the first one. Fire punched up through the opening and rolled along the cracked hillside. The scream that came out of the shaft was no longer even partly animal. It was rage, pain, and something like refusal all at once. Then the ground gave a short, ugly shudder. Stone shifted below. Silence followed. Real silence this time. Not waiting, not listening, just absence. Owen clung to me while black smoke curled into the night. I held him with one arm and pressed the other hand against my bleeding leg, unable to move for a long minute. When I finally looked back toward the main tunnel, I saw no sign of Walter. Only the fallen shotgun near the entrance and one length of chain disappearing into darkness. We stayed until dawn because I could not leave without knowing. When the smoke thinned enough, I looked down into the shaft. What remained at the bottom no longer resembled anything that could climb, choose, or wait. Charred flesh, broken structure, a face I knew only by the ruined line of the jaw and the yellowed film over one dead eye. We left Jerome after sunrise. I never saw Walter again. A month later, Owen and I moved north for good. New apartment, new school, new job. I limp when the weather turns cold. He no longer draws tunnels. That should feel like healing. Sometimes it does. But every night before bed, I check every lock and every window. Not because I think this one survived, because somewhere under too many old American towns there are tunnels, mine cuts, service shafts, storm drains, forgotten openings in stone, places people stop thinking about because daylight keeps touching the surface and making it all seem used up. I know better now. Places don't have to be empty to belong to something else. And some things do not announce themselves by what they are, only by what they choose.